Have you ever wondered what happens when two people who despise each other realize they are the only ones capable of ruling the world? Our marriage was never meant to be a sanctuary. It was a siege. There were no whispers of devotion, only the heavy, rhythmic scratch of a quill against parchment, and the scent of bitter wax sealing a fate we both fought to control. We stood at the altar like two statues carved from ice, bound not by affection, but by a shared lethal ambition. They looked at us and saw a tragedy of convenience. They did not realize that a common enemy is far more intoxicating than a common heart. The first months were a study in silence. We lived in the same wing of the estate, yet we moved like two ghosts haunting different centuries. At dinner, the table was a vast mahogany desert. I would watch him across the candelabra, his face a mask of disciplined indifference. And I knew he was counting my father's titles just as I was calculating the yield of his northern ports. There was no pretense of warmth. We spoke in the language of logistics. The grain tax has risen. The Countess expects us on Tuesday. It was a marriage of ledgers, a cold peace maintained by the sheer necessity of our survival. I loathed the way he occupied space, his every movement a reminder of the cage I had traded my freedom for. But even then, in that frigid isolation, a strange pattern began to emerge. We were not just husband and wife. We were two architects building a fortress of mutual interest, waiting for the first crack in the world outside to show us why we had truly been brought together.
As this story unfolds, grant us your favor, stay within our circle, and keep watch, and tell us, where do you think this path will lead?
The shift did not come from a grand romantic gesture, but from a threat to our shared walls. It was a Tuesday in early autumn when the Duke's envoy arrived, bearing a decree that would have stripped Julian of his northern trade rights, and me of the influence I had spent years cultivating. I remember watching Julian in the library. He didn't pace. He sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the seal of the document as if he could set it ablaze with a thought. For the first time, I didn't see a rival husband. I saw a mirror. "They expect us to plead," he said, his voice a low, dangerous hum. "They expect us to be divided," I replied, stepping from the shadows. Our eyes met, and for a fleeting second, the coldness between us turned into a spark of recognition. We spent that night not in separate beds, but over a single map, hunched like conspirators. I watched Julian's finger trace the supply lines, and he watched as I dictated a response so diplomatically poisonous it would ruin the Duke by Christmas. He looked at me then, truly looked at me, and said, "Elara, you have the heart of a general." It was the first time he had used my name without a sneer. I felt a strange, sharp jolt in my chest. It wasn't love. It was the thrill of finding a weapon as sharp as my own. By dawn, the decree was a dead letter, and the Duke was a broken man. We had won our first battle, and the air in the manor finally began to warm, not with affection, but with the heat of the kill. The months that followed transformed the manor. The drawing room, once a stage for stiff courtesies, became our command center. It was no longer a house of two strangers. It was the seat of a dual monarchy. Julian managed the steel and the coin, while I, Elara, navigated the labyrinth of court whispers and social executions. We developed a rhythm that was terrifying in its efficiency. At breakfast, we didn't discuss the weather. We discussed which minister was susceptible to bribery. During the long winter evenings, we sat by the fire, but we didn't read poetry. We read ledgers. I began to realize that I knew the exact shade of Julian's eyes, not because I had looked for beauty, but because I was searching for his reaction to my latest maneuver. There's a particular intimacy in shared secrets that lovers will never understand. When we stood together at court, the nobility whispered about our unfortunate arrangement. They pitied us. They saw the lack of hand-holding and the absence of soft glances, and they thought us hollow. They were fools. They couldn't see the electricity between us when our eyes met across a ballroom, a silent signal that a trap had been sprung. They didn't know that every time Julian leaned in to whisper a political casualty in my ear, it felt more intimate than a kiss. We weren't falling in love. We were falling into a profound, dark synchronization. The power was no longer just a goal. It was becoming the very air we breathed together. The night our final adversary fell, the air in the library felt heavy, charged with the static of a brewing storm. Julian stood by the window, the moonlight catching the sharp edge of his jaw, while I sat at the desk, watching the wax melt on the last letter of our victory. We had done it. We had dismantled a century of opposition in a single season. When he turned to look at me, there was no victory cry, only a silence so dense it made my heart hammer against my ribs. He walked toward me, not as a husband approaching a wife, but as a king approaching his only equal. He placed his hands on the desk, leaning in until I could smell the faint scent of ink and expensive brandy. "They are all gone, Elara," he whispered, his voice vibrating with a hunger that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with conquest. "The board is empty. There is only us." In that moment, the realization hit me like a physical blow. The adrenaline of our shared ruthlessness was a more potent aphrodisiac than any romantic sentiment. I didn't want his flowers or his poetry. I wanted the fire in his eyes that mirrored my own. As his hand covered mine, the touch wasn't soft. It was a claim. We were intoxicated, not by wine, but by the sheer, terrifying scale of what we had seized together. The silence that followed was not the icy void of our first months, but the heavy stillness of a storm that had finally found its eye. That night, amidst the library shadows and the scent of scorched sealing wax, the contract binding us ceased to be a mere scrap of parchment to become something living, pulsing between us. We needed no vows of love or empty promises. What we held was the unbreakable pact of two predators who recognized, in one another, the only creature worthy of sharing the feast. There, while the rest of the kingdom slept in its ignorance, we shed the skin of strangers and were reborn as a single will, forged in the cold of calculation and the heat of conquest. Years have passed since that night, and the world now bows to the house of Julian and Elara. Our halls are silent, and our bed remains a place of quiet, strategic truce. They still whisper at court, calling ours a loveless match, a cold cage of duty. Let them. They have their fleeting hearts, their fragile romances that wither with the first frost. We have something far more permanent. We found a truth they will never comprehend, that when two shadows merge to eclipse the sun, they no longer need the light. We don't love each other. We are each other. And in the end, that is the only empire worth having.
If this tale has pleased your heart, grant us your favor and stand beside us.
And if you wish to hear many more, join us and keep watch for what comes next.